Sometimes the loneliest person in the room is the one nobody remembers to give a gift to. Snow drifted slowly across Fifth Avenue, turning the glowing streets of Manhattan into something almost unreal. Christmas music floated through the air from hidden speakers, soft and nostalgic, while volunteers in red scarves hurried in and out of the Callaway winter gift drive carrying boxes wrapped in shiny paper and silver ribbon. Inside the massive charity hall, children laughed beside oversized candy canes, families lined up for hot cocoa, and camera flashes exploded every few seconds as reporters documented another holiday event sponsored by billionaire Ethan Callaway. The giant Christmas tree in the center of the room stretched nearly 20 feet high, glowing gold beneath hundreds of tiny lights. But Ethan barely looked at it as he adjusted the cuff of his dark wool coat and forced another polite smile for the cameras. "Mr. Callaway, one photo near the donation wall," a reporter called out brightly. Ethan nodded without enthusiasm. He had attended this same event every December for the last 6 years, always staying exactly 20 minutes before disappearing back into the quiet isolation of his penthouse overlooking Central Park. To everyone else, he was generous, successful, untouchable. But Christmas had stopped feeling warm to Ethan a very long time ago. "You're zoning out again," Claire Donovan whispered as she stepped beside him, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "You've been here 16 minutes. For more, and you're free." Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "You timed me. I know you," Claire replied gently. "And I know you hate Christmas parties." Ethan looked away before answering. "I don't hate Christmas." But even he knew the words sounded hollow. Across the crowded hall, volunteers began stacking empty boxes while families slowly filtered toward the exits, carrying blankets, toys, and grocery bags. The event was almost over. Another successful charity campaign. Another headline waiting to be published by morning. Ethan reached for his phone, ready to leave, when something near the far corner of the room caught his attention. A girl sat, completely alone beneath a dim strand of flickering lights near the back wall, partially hidden behind the enormous tree. She couldn't have been older than 24. A cream-colored coat hung loosely around her shoulders, and her hands rested quietly in her lap, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Beside her sat a single, unopened Christmas gift box with a red ribbon crossing the top. Everyone else had already left with their presents. She hadn't touched hers. Ethan frowned slightly. "Who's that?" Claire followed his gaze. Probably someone waiting for a ride. But Ethan noticed something Claire didn't. The girl wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't checking her phone either. She was staring at the gift tag attached to the box like it physically hurt to look at it. For some reason, he couldn't explain why, Ethan stopped walking. Around them, workers folded tables and unplugged decorations while Bing Crosby played softly through the speakers overhead. Yet the farther the room emptied, the more noticeable the girl became sitting there alone beneath the dying Christmas lights. Ethan watched as she slowly rubbed her thumb across the edge of the tag before lowering her eyes again. There was something painfully familiar about that expression. Not sadness exactly. More like the quiet exhaustion of someone trying very hard not to cry in public. "Sir," one of the assistants asked carefully, "your car is waiting outside." Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl in the corner. Then, without fully understanding why, he loosened the gloves in his hand and started walking toward her. The closer Ethan walked toward her, the quieter the room seemed to become. Behind him, volunteers rolled carts filled with leftover decorations toward the loading dock, while strands of white lights blinked lazily above the nearly empty hall. Snow tapped softly against the tall windows facing the street, and somewhere near the entrance, a child laughed before the sound faded into the distance. The girl still had not looked up. Ethan stopped a few feet away, noticing how tightly she held the sleeve of her coat in one hand, almost like she was trying to steady herself. Up close, she looked exhausted. Not physically tired alone, but emotionally worn down in a way he recognized immediately. "The event's over," Ethan said quietly, his voice gentler than usual. "You know that, right?" The girl blinked once before finally lifting her eyes toward him. They were pale blue, rimmed slightly red like she had been holding back tears for hours. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she gave a small nod. "I know." Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the music overhead. Ethan glanced at the unopened gift beside her. "You did not take yours." She looked down at the box again, fingers brushing lightly over the tag attached to the ribbon. It does not belong to me. Ethan frowned slightly. Your name is on it. That does not mean it belongs to me. There was no bitterness in the way she said it. Somehow that made the words heavier. Ethan slid his hands into the pockets of his coat and glanced around the room. Workers were shutting off sections of lights one row at a time now, slowly darkening the enormous hall. Are you waiting for someone? He asked. She hesitated just long enough for him to know the answer before she spoke. Not anymore. Something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. He had spent years surrounded by people and still understood loneliness the second he heard it in another person's voice. The girl carefully removed the gift tag from the ribbon and stared at it for another moment before quietly reading the words printed across the front. For someone who still believes. Ethan looked at the tag, then back at her. That is a strange thing to write on a Christmas gift. A faint smile appeared on her face for less than a second before disappearing again. Maybe not in New York. Ethan almost smiled back, but instead he asked, What is your name? Hannah. Ethan. Her eyes narrowed slightly with recognition, though not because of his last name. More because his face looked familiar in the way famous people sometimes do, without immediately placing why. You work for the event? She asked. Ethan nodded once. Something like that. Hannah looked back toward the massive Christmas tree glowing at the center of the hall. It is beautiful in here, she whispered. Kind of feels sad when everyone leaves, though. Ethan followed her gaze upward. Hundreds of gold lights shimmered against glass ornaments while fake snow dusted the branches. It should have felt warm. Instead, the room suddenly looked enormous and empty. Hannah slowly stood from the chair, holding the unopened gift carefully against her chest. Ethan noticed her gloves did not match. One was gray wool, the other black knit with a small tear near the thumb. Tiny details people usually overlooked. You should probably get home before the storm gets worse, Ethan said. Hannah lowered her eyes. Yeah, but she did not move toward the exit. Ethan looked through the tall windows again. Snowfall had become heavier now, coating the sidewalks outside in thick white layers. Traffic crawled slowly through the avenue while icy wind rattled against the glass. Do you have a car? He asked. Hannah let out a soft laugh that sounded more tired than amused. No train. Delayed. Ethan nodded slowly. Someone picking you up? Hannah stayed quiet this time. That silence told him everything. Somewhere behind them, the final row of overhead lights clicked off, leaving only the giant Christmas tree illuminating the hall in warm gold reflections. Hannah stared at the glowing branches for a long moment before speaking so quietly Ethan almost missed it. My mom used to love Christmas lights, she whispered. She said they made lonely places feel less lonely. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time that night, he no longer felt like leaving. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The giant Christmas tree shimmered softly between them, casting warm golden light across the nearly empty hall, while snow continued swirling outside the tall glass windows. Ethan could hear workers laughing faintly near the loading dock, but the farther the night moved on, the more distant everything else seemed to feel. Hannah adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag over her shoulder and glanced toward the entrance. I should probably go before the train stopped completely, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once, but his feet stayed planted where they were. Usually, he would have already been halfway home by now, sitting alone in the back seat of his black SUV while the city blurred past his tinted windows. That routine had become automatic years ago. Appear, smile, donate, leave. But tonight something felt different, and he could not explain why. You really do not have anyone coming for you? He asked carefully. Hannah hesitated before giving a small shake of her head. Not anymore. The words landed heavier this time. Ethan looked at the unopened gift still in her arms. What is inside the box? Hannah glanced down at it and shrugged faintly. I did not check. You sat here 3 hours without opening it. Another tired smile touched her lips. I guess I like pretending somebody picked it for me. Ethan felt an ache in his chest he had not expected. She said this sentence so casually, but loneliness always sounded different when it came from someone who had gotten used to carrying it alone. Near the ceiling, the last strands of decorative lights flickered once before half the room dimmed again. One of the volunteers called out, "We are shutting down in 5 minutes." Hannah gave a quick nod toward the staff member before turning back toward Ethan. Sorry, she said softly. I know I probably look pathetic sitting here. Ethan answered immediately. You do not. She blinked slightly, surprised by how fast he said it. Ethan loosened his scarf and glanced toward the windows again. Snow was falling harder now, thick enough to blur the headlights outside into soft, glowing streaks. The subway is probably going to be delayed all night, he muttered. Hannah let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That sounds about right. Where are you staying? The question slipped out before Ethan fully thought about it. Hannah lowered her eyes instantly. A friend's couch. Temporarily. Ethan noticed the way her fingers tightened around the gift box when she answered. Another small detail. Another quiet lie meant to sound less painful than the truth. He did not push further. Instead, he looked toward a folding table near the back where volunteers had left untouched trays of cookies and paper cups beside cooling hot chocolate dispensers. Have you eaten tonight? Hannah shook her head once. Not really. Ethan nodded toward the refreshment table. Come on. You do not have to do that. It is hot chocolate, he replied softly. Not a marriage proposal. For the first time that evening, Hannah laughed for real. The sound caught Ethan off guard because it changed her entire face. Suddenly she looked younger, warmer, less guarded. Ethan walked beside her through the quiet hall toward the refreshment table while workers continued stacking chairs around them. Hannah carefully set the unopened gift beside a tray of sugar cookies while Ethan poured 2 cups of hot chocolate. Steam curled softly upward between them. You come to these events often? He asked. Hannah wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup before answering. My mom used to volunteer at Christmas drives every year. Her voice softened immediately at the mention of her mother. She believed nobody should feel forgotten during the holidays. Ethan stayed quiet, letting her continue. After she got sick, we could not really afford gifts anymore, Hannah whispered. But she still made ornaments by hand every Christmas Eve. She reached slowly into her coat pocket and pulled out something small wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Ethan watched as she unfolded it gently in her palm. A tiny paper angel ornament appeared beneath the golden tree lights, delicate and handmade, with slightly bent wings and fading silver paint around the edges. This was the last one she ever made, Hannah said quietly. Ethan stared at the ornament longer than he meant to. Something about it felt heartbreakingly fragile, like the kind of thing most people would accidentally throw away without realizing its value. Hannah carefully brushed her thumb across one paper wing before whispering almost to herself, I think I just did not want to spend Christmas completely alone this year. And for the first time in many years, Ethan realized he did not want that either. The snowstorm outside intensified so quickly that within 20 minutes, Fifth Avenue looked almost frozen in time. White flakes spun wildly beneath the streetlights while yellow taxi cabs crawled through thick slush and long lines of people crowded beneath store awnings trying to escape the wind. Inside the nearly empty charity hall, the warmth from the hot chocolate had faded, but neither Ethan nor Hannah seemed eager to leave. Workers continued shutting down the event around them, folding tables and carrying leftover decorations into storage crates while old Christmas songs played softly through half-muted speakers overhead. Hannah carefully wrapped the tiny paper angel back inside its tissue paper before slipping it into her coat pocket again. Ethan watched her movements quietly. The ornament looked fragile enough to fall apart in someone else's hands, but Hannah handled it like something sacred. Your mother made those every year? He asked. Hannah nodded. Hundreds of them. A small smile touched her face as she stared toward the glowing Christmas tree nearby. She used to hang them everywhere. Apartment windows, kitchen cabinets, even our bathroom mirror once. Ethan let out a soft laugh under his breath. Bathroom mirror? She said Christmas should reach every corner of a home. Her smile faded slightly after that, especially the lonely ones. Ethan looked down into his untouched cup. He remembered his own mother filling their penthouse with decorations when he was a child. Garland wrapped around stair railings. Cinnamon candles burning late into the night. Soft jazz records spinning while snow fell outside enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. After she died, every decoration disappeared. His father never spoke about Christmas again. Neither did Ethan. What about you? Hannah asked gently. Ethan looked up. What about me? You seem like someone who used to love Christmas once. The question caught him off guard because it was true. He glanced toward the snowfall outside before answering quietly. My mother died on Christmas Eve when I was 19. Hannah's expression softened instantly. I am sorry. Ethan gave a small shrug, though the memory still sat heavy in his chest even after all these years. After that, The holidays started feeling more like memories than something real. Hannah studied him silently for a moment. That is kind of sad. Ethan almost smiled. You are very honest. My mom said lonely people usually tell the truth faster. For some reason, that sentence stayed with him. Before Ethan could answer, Claire approached from across the hall holding her tablet against her chest. Ethan, your driver has been waiting almost 40 minutes, she said carefully before noticing Hannah standing beside him. Claire immediately offered a polite smile. Hi. Hannah nodded politely in return and took a small step backward, suddenly more self-conscious. Ethan noticed it immediately. Claire, this is Hannah. Claire's eyes flickered briefly toward the unopened gift box still sitting beside the empty hot chocolate cups before looking back at Ethan with quiet understanding. The roads are getting worse, Claire warned gently. The mayor is already talking about subway closures. Hannah lowered her eyes at that. Ethan saw the reaction instantly. How far are you going? He asked her. Brooklyn. Claire let out a quiet breath. Good luck with that tonight. Hannah gave an embarrassed smile. Yeah. Ethan looked through the window again as icy wind swept snow across the avenue in thick, white waves. People outside hurried through the storm with their heads lowered against the cold. I can have my driver take you home, Ethan said calmly. Hannah immediately shook her head. No, it is okay. It is snowing sideways outside. I will figure it out. Ethan recognized pride when he heard it. The same kind he carried himself for years after losing his mother. The kind that made people refuse help even when they desperately needed it. Claire glanced between them before quietly excusing herself and walking away toward the entrance. Hannah picked up the unopened gift box and adjusted her coat again. Thank you for the hot chocolate, she said softly. And for talking to me. Ethan watched her start toward the exit beneath the dim Christmas lights, moving slowly through the giant empty hall while workers shut down the final decorations behind her. Then she stopped suddenly near the doorway and pressed one hand lightly against the wall beside her. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Hannah. She tried to straighten up too quickly. I am fine. But even from several feet away, Ethan could see the color drain from her face. Ethan crossed the room immediately. Hannah. She tried to straighten again, forcing a quick smile that did not reach her eyes. Seriously, I am okay. But her voice sounded weak now, thinner than before, and one hand remained pressed against the wall beside the exit as though it was the only thing keeping her steady. Snow swirled violently outside the glass doors behind her, coating the sidewalk in thick white layers while freezing wind rattled the metal frames. Ethan stopped directly in front of her, close enough to notice the faint trembling in her fingers. You are pale, he said quietly. Hannah looked embarrassed more than anything else. I just stood up too fast. Ethan glanced down at the untouched tray of cookies near the refreshment table and suddenly understood. When was the last time you actually ate? Hannah avoided his eyes. That answer alone was enough. Ethan exhaled slowly and softened his voice. Hannah. She finally looked up at him. Yesterday morning, she admitted quietly. The words hit him harder than he expected. You have not eaten since yesterday? I had coffee. Ethan stared at her for a second, almost unable to process how casually she said it. Outside, headlights glowed through the snowfall, while distant sirens echoed somewhere deep in Manhattan. The entire city was rushing home for Christmas Eve, and this girl had spent the night pretending hot chocolate counted as dinner. Sit down, Ethan said gently. I am fine. You almost collapsed. Hannah hesitated before finally allowing him to guide her back toward one of the folding chairs near the giant tree. She looked mortified by the attention, like being hungry embarrassed her more than the hunger itself. Ethan grabbed 2 unopened snack boxes left behind by the volunteers and placed one carefully in front of her. Hannah stared at it for a moment before quietly asking, Are you always this bossy? Ethan almost smiled. Only when someone is trying to survive on coffee. For the first time in hours, Hannah gave a small laugh again. She slowly opened the snack box and took a careful bite from the sandwich inside, almost apologetically. Ethan sat across from her while the last volunteers wheeled storage bins toward the back exits. The giant Christmas tree still glowed warmly behind them, now standing in the middle of a nearly silent hall. You do not have to sit here and babysit me, Hannah murmured after a few minutes. I know. Then why are you? Ethan looked down briefly before answering honestly. Because I think if I leave right now, you are going to disappear. Hannah froze slightly at the words. Ethan surprised himself too. He had not planned to say that out loud. Hannah lowered her eyes to the half-eaten sandwich in her hands. People usually leave first, she whispered. Something about the way she said it made the room feel even quieter. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her more carefully now. Her coat sleeves were frayed near the wrists. There was dried paint on the edge of one fingernail, faint blue and silver. Her canvas bag looked old enough to fall apart at the seams. Tiny clues of a life slowly unraveling. "What do you do?" he asked softly. Hannah swallowed before answering. "I used to study illustration at Pratt." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Used to?" She nodded slowly. "I dropped out this fall after my mom got sick." "You were an artist?" A faint sadness crossed her face. "Trying to be." Ethan glanced toward the small tissue paper bundle still tucked carefully inside her coat pocket. The paper angel. Handmade. Delicate. Suddenly the paint on her fingernails made sense. "Your mother taught you?" Hannah smiled softly this time. "Everything." Ethan watched her quietly while snow continued piling against the windows outside. For years he had spent Christmas surrounded by executives, reporters, and expensive decorations that meant absolutely nothing to him. But sitting across from Hannah beneath the fading lights of an almost empty charity hall somehow felt more real than any holiday celebration he could remember. Then Hannah looked toward the entrance again, and her expression shifted slightly. "I should still go soon," she said. Quietly. "My friend is probably waiting." Ethan noticed it immediately this time. Another lie. Small, careful, lonely. And for reasons he still did not fully understand, he suddenly wanted very badly to know where she was actually planning to sleep that night. The last volunteer finally waved goodbye near the loading dock, and one by one the remaining lights inside the hall dimmed until only the giant Christmas tree continued glowing against the dark windows. Outside, the storm had become brutal. Snow buried parked cars halfway up their tires, and freezing wind sent icy powder spiraling through the streets like white smoke. Ethan checked his phone briefly before slipping it back into his coat pocket. "The city just suspended half the subway lines," he said quietly. Hannah looked down immediately, trying to hide her reaction. "I will figure something out." Ethan studied her for a second. "You keep saying that." "Because I always do." There was pride in her voice again, but exhaustion too. Hannah stood slowly from the folding chair and picked up her canvas bag along with the unopened Christmas gift. Ethan noticed how tightly she held everything she owned close to her chest, like she had learned not to trust the world with any part of her life. "Where exactly is this friend's apartment?" he asked calmly. Hannah hesitated. "Too long." Ethan already knew the answer before she finally whispered, "Queens." "You said Brooklyn earlier." Hannah froze. The silence between them stretched painfully for a moment before she looked away toward the snowy windows. "I did not want you to feel sorry for me," she admitted softly. Ethan lowered his voice. "Hannah." She swallowed hard. "I have been staying in different places since October. Sometimes shelters, sometimes couches, sometimes nowhere." Ethan felt something twist sharply in his chest. He had spent years hearing polished speeches about homelessness and struggling New Yorkers at charity galas, but sitting across from someone quietly living through it felt entirely different. Hannah gave a weak laugh, without humor. "Merry Christmas, right?" Ethan did not laugh. He simply looked at her for a long moment before asking carefully, "Why did you not tell anyone at the event?" "Because people look at you differently after that." Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor now, like you stopped being a person and became a problem. Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him. He glanced around the nearly empty hall with its expensive decorations, polished floors, and giant glowing tree. Suddenly the entire event felt strangely hollow. Thousands of gifts handed out. Cameras everywhere. Speeches about hope and community. Yet somehow Hannah still almost walked out into a snowstorm with nowhere to sleep. Ethan exhaled slowly and stood from his chair. "You are not going back out there tonight." Hannah immediately shook her head. No. I am not taking charity from some rich stranger." Ethan stared at her for a second before a small smile finally touched his face. "You still do not know who I am, do you?" Hannah frowned slightly. "You said your name was Ethan." Before he could answer, a television mounted near the far wall suddenly flickered to life as one of the cleanup crew switched channels. A local news anchor appeared on screen beside footage from earlier that evening. Billionaire entrepreneur Ethan Callaway hosted the annual Callaway Winter Gift Drive tonight. donating nearly $5 million toward holiday relief programs across New York City. Hannah's eyes widened slowly as footage of Ethan shaking hands with reporters filled the screen behind him. She looked from the television back to the man standing in front of her, realization washing over her face piece by piece. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Yeah." Hannah stared at him in complete disbelief. "You are Ethan Calloway." "Unfortunately, yes." She took a small step backward instantly, embarrassment flooding her expression. "I sat here talking to you for hours and did not even realize. That is probably the nicest thing anyone has done for me in years." But Hannah barely heard him now. Her cheeks flushed with humiliation as she glanced down at her worn coat, her torn gloves, the half-eaten sandwich still sitting beside the paper cup. "I should go." Ethan frowned immediately. "Why?" "Because this is ridiculous." "What is ridiculous?" "This." She motioned helplessly between them. "You are a billionaire." Ethan looked at her quietly. "And you are Hannah." But she was already shaking her head, stepping farther away while snow battered the windows behind her. "People like you do not just sit around talking to people like me." Ethan's expression softened. "Maybe that is the problem." For a few seconds, the only sound in the hall was the storm pounding against the windows. Hannah stood frozen near the entrance beneath the fading Christmas lights, clutching the unopened gift box tightly against her chest, while Ethan remained beside the glowing tree, watching her carefully. The television continued playing quietly in the background, showing footage of Ethan smiling beside city officials and reporters from earlier that night. Hannah looked back at the screen once more before lowering her eyes. "You should have told me," she whispered. Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat. "Would it have changed anything?" Hannah gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Probably everything." Ethan studied her expression closely. The warmth between them from earlier had shifted now into something fragile and uncertain. He recognized the distance immediately. He had seen it in people his entire life after they learned who he was. Suddenly, every conversation became careful, measured, unequal. "Hannah, I did not sit with you because I felt sorry for you. You donated $5 million tonight," she replied quietly. "People like me probably look invisible from where you stand." Ethan frowned slightly. "You were the only person in that room I actually noticed." Hannah looked away before he could see the emotion flicker across her face. Snow blasted sideways against the glass doors behind her, while freezing wind howled faintly through the cracks around the entrance. "I should go," she said again, softer this time. Ethan stepped forward once. "Into a blizzard? I have survived worse." The sentence came out automatically, but the exhaustion underneath it was impossible to miss. Ethan lowered his voice. "That is exactly what worries me." Hannah swallowed hard and adjusted the strap of her canvas bag over her shoulder. "You do not even know me." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I know you stayed 3 hours at a Christmas drive because you did not want to feel forgotten." Hannah's eyes lifted slowly toward his. "I know you have not had a real meal in almost 2 days." He took another step closer, his voice still calm and gentle. "I know your mother made paper angels because she wanted lonely places to feel less lonely." Hannah blinked rapidly and looked down again before her emotions could fully surface. Ethan continued quietly. "And I know you are about to walk into a storm pretending you are fine because asking for help feels worse than freezing." The hall fell silent again. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed faintly across the city. Midnight. Christmas Eve. Hannah pressed her lips together tightly, fighting tears now more than embarrassment. "I am not asking you to save me," she whispered. Ethan shook his head immediately. "Good. Because I am not trying to." She looked confused by that answer. Ethan glanced toward the snow-covered avenue outside before speaking again. "I just do not think anyone should be alone tonight." Hannah stared at him quietly, uncertain what to believe anymore. For years she had learned to distrust kindness that came too easily. Usually it disappeared the moment people realized helping her would not be simple or temporary. Yet Ethan still stood there looking at her like she mattered. Like she was not just another sad story passing through his charity event. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small black umbrella keycard attached to a silver hotel emblem. "There is a hotel 3 blocks from here," he said carefully. "The Calloway owns the top floors. Empty suites. Warm bed. Room service. No cameras. No reporters." Hannah immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not." Ethan almost smiled at how fast she answered. It is not charity. Then what is it? Ethan looked at her quietly beneath the glow of the giant Christmas tree. Maybe it is just one lonely person trying to help another one get through Christmas Eve. Hannah's eyes softened slightly, but hesitation still lingered there. Ethan slowly placed the hotel keycard on the table beside the untouched hot chocolate cups, instead of handing it directly to her. No pressure, no pity, just an option. You do not owe me anything, he said gently. Not a conversation, not gratitude, nothing. Hannah stared at the silver keycard while snow continued falling heavily outside the windows. Then her eyes drifted slowly toward the tiny tissue-wrapped paper angel tucked safely inside her coat pocket. Her mother's last ornament. Her last piece of home. Ethan watched her quietly, and for the first time in many years, he realized he cared far more about what one frightened girl decided next than any business deal waiting for him after Christmas. Hannah stared at the silver hotel keycard resting beside the empty paper cups while the storm outside continued swallowing the city in white. The giant Christmas tree glowed softly behind Ethan, reflecting gold light across the polished floor, and for a moment the entire hall felt suspended outside of time. Neither of them moved. Hannah finally looked up at him again, uncertainty written all over her face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered honestly. "Because somebody should have done it sooner." The words settled between them gently, without pity or performance. Hannah lowered her eyes again. Her entire life over the past few months had become a series of closed doors, apologetic smiles, and people quietly deciding her problems were too heavy to carry. Yet Ethan stood there offering warmth without asking for anything back. That frightened her more than the storm outside. "People always say there is no catch," she whispered softly. "Then later you realized there was." Ethan nodded once, like he understood exactly what she meant. "Then do not trust me yet." Hannah blinked slightly. Ethan leaned back against the table near the glowing tree, his voice calm and steady. "Take the room because it is freezing outside. Sleep because you are exhausted. Eat breakfast tomorrow. After that, if you never want to see me again, you do not have to." Hannah studied him carefully, almost searching for signs he was lying. But his expression remained quiet. Tired. Human. Not the polished billionaire from the television screen. Just a man standing beneath Christmas lights looking strangely lonely himself. "You really mean that?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a faint smile. "I am too tired to manipulate anyone tonight." A tiny laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Ethan smiled a little more at the sound. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen briefly before silencing it. Hannah noticed the name flashing across it. Claire. Probably wondering where he disappeared to. Probably surrounded by people waiting for him somewhere warm and luxurious across the city. "You should go," Hannah murmured. "You probably have important Christmas parties or family dinners or billionaire things." Ethan looked at her for a second before quietly replying, "I do not have family dinners anymore." The honesty in his voice surprised both of them. Hannah's expression softened again. Ethan looked toward the giant Christmas tree nearby. "Honestly, this is the longest conversation I have had on Christmas Eve in years." Hannah swallowed hard at that. Loneliness recognized loneliness. Maybe that was why sitting beside him all night had started feeling strangely easy. Ethan slowly picked up the unopened Christmas gift box from the table and held it out toward her. "You forgot this." Hannah accepted it carefully. "I still do not know what is inside. Maybe you should finally open it." She hesitated before slowly pulling apart the red ribbon. The paper crinkled softly beneath her fingers while Ethan watched quietly beside her. Inside the box sat a thick knitted cream scarf, a small watercolor paint set, and a handwritten card tucked carefully beneath the tissue paper. Hannah unfolded the note slowly. Her eyes moved across the words before her expression shifted completely. "What does it say?" Ethan asked gently. Hannah's voice almost broke as she read it aloud. "For the ones still creating beauty, even after life breaks their heart." Silence filled the hall after that. Ethan watched tears gather in her eyes while her fingers trembled slightly around the card. "My mom used to say almost the exact same thing," she whispered. Ethan looked at the watercolor paints inside the box. "Then maybe she would want you to keep painting." Hannah pressed her lips together tightly, overwhelmed now in a way she could no longer hide. She quickly wiped beneath one eye, embarrassed by the tears. Ethan pretended not to notice. Outside, Snow continued falling heavily against the dark Manhattan skyline, while the giant Christmas tree shimmered quietly behind them. Hannah looked down at the hotel keycard once more. Then finally, slowly, she picked it up from the table. Ethan did not smile triumphantly. He simply nodded once, relieved in a way he had not expected to feel. Hannah tucked the keycard carefully into her coat pocket beside the tiny paper angel ornament from her mother. Two small things. Two fragile pieces of hope. And as Ethan walked beside her toward the snowy entrance doors, he realized that for the first time in years, Christmas no longer felt completely empty. The hotel lobby smelled faintly like cedarwood and cinnamon when Ethan and Hannah stepped inside from the storm. Snow clung to the shoulders of their coats while warm golden light reflected across marble floors and towering garlands wrapped around crystal chandeliers overhead. A pianist near the fireplace played slow Christmas songs so softly they almost sounded like memories. Hannah stopped just inside the entrance, staring quietly at the enormous tree standing in the center of the lobby. It was beautiful in the expensive New York way everything connected to Ethan's world seemed to be. Elegant. Perfect. Untouchable. Ethan noticed the uncertainty return to her expression immediately. "You can still change your mind," he said gently. Hannah looked at him. "I know." But she did not leave. Ethan guided her toward the elevators while the front desk staff politely greeted him by name. Hannah lowered her eyes the second she heard employees calling him Mr. Calloway. The difference between their worlds suddenly felt enormous again. Ethan noticed her retreat inward almost instantly. "Hey," he said quietly as the elevator doors opened. Hannah looked up. "You do not have to feel uncomfortable here." She gave him a faint smile. "Easy for you to say." The elevator climbed silently toward the upper floors while snow-covered Manhattan stretched endlessly outside the glass walls. Hannah held the unopened cream scarf and watercolor paints carefully against her chest the entire ride, like she still could not believe they belonged to her. When the elevator doors finally opened onto the private hotel level, Ethan led her down a quiet hallway lined with soft amber lights and framed winter paintings. He stopped outside one of the suites and handed her the keycard. Hannah looked at it for a second before whispering, "I do not know how to thank you for this." Ethan leaned lightly against the wall beside the door. "Then do not." Hannah smiled softly despite herself. Slowly, she opened the suite door. Warm light spilled across the hallway instantly. The room inside overlooked the snowy Manhattan skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and beside the couch stood a small decorated Christmas tree glowing quietly in the dark. Hannah stepped inside like someone afraid to touch anything. Ethan remained near the doorway, giving her space. "There is food in the kitchen," he said, "and probably way too many blankets." Hannah turned slowly toward him again. Her eyes looked brighter now, less frightened somehow. "You really spend Christmas Eve helping random girls from charity events?" Ethan gave a small smile. "First time." She laughed softly under her breath. The sound warmed something inside him he had forgotten existed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted peacefully beyond the windows while the city glittered below them in white and gold. Then Hannah carefully reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the tiny paper angel ornament again. "My mom used to say angels appear when people are about to give up," she whispered. Ethan looked at the fragile paper wings in her hand. "Sounds like your mom was smarter than most people." Hannah smiled sadly. "She would have liked you." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly at that. "I think I would have liked her too." Silence settled comfortably between them after that. Not awkward, just quiet in the way lonely. People sometimes become quiet when they finally feel safe enough to breathe. Hannah glanced once more toward the snowfall outside before looking back at Ethan. "You know what is strange?" she asked softly. "What?" "Tonight is the first time since my mom died that Christmas does not feel completely empty." Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly at her words. He looked around the softly lit suite, the glowing tree, the falling snow outside the windows, then back at Hannah standing there holding that tiny paper angel, like hope itself could still break if she held it too tightly. And suddenly he realized something that terrified him a little. Somewhere between the empty charity hall, the paper ornament, the hot chocolate, and the storm outside, Hannah Brooks had quietly become the most important part of his Christmas. Ethan smiled gently at her then, softer than he had smiled at anyone in years. "Maybe lonely people are supposed to find each other," he said quietly. Hannah looked at him for a long moment before finally whispering, "Maybe." And outside, Beneath the snowfall covering New York City in white, Christmas Eve no longer felt lonely at all.